Hello friends, hold on to your chairs. This is going to be a bit of a bumpy ride. Every story of educational disruption over the years has ended in the same way. Technology changes, jobs disappear, new jobs appear, and schools adjust. Life goes on. Agriculture mechanized and schools carried on. Factories replaced craft work and schools adapted. Computers entered offices and schools added IT labs. Each time the pattern held. Some pain, yes. Some lag, yes, but never collapse. So when people say we've been there before, they're not wrong, but they may be fatally complacent. And here's what's different now is that the way I see it. A child starting school this year in September will graduate in 13 years. 13 years. In that time, artificial intelligence will not simply improve, it will compress. Major players are projecting artificial general intelligence, AGI, within this time frame. Systems capable of recursive self-improvement, able to solve problems that we currently think that are out of, beyond our reach. And it's already reading legal documents and analyzing medical images and writing software and generating lesson plans and writing reports and strategic summaries, all of it instantly, at scale, for almost nothing. That alone would be significant. But software really is only half of the story as I see it. For the first time, intelligence is being embodied. Think about it. Companies like Tesla are projecting humanoid robot production not in thousands, but in hundreds of millions, billions over time. The claim is not that robots will replace some workers. The claim is that once a physical task is learned by one machine, it can be copied instantly by all of them. Not just limited to driving vehicles and factory processes, but complex tasks such as surgery. Companies like Tesla and Boston Dynamics are already mapping and replicating specific workplace processes. So how long will it be at this rate before every physical action that can be captured is learned once and then deployed everywhere? This is not mechanization, it's like replication. Historically, machines replaced muscle. Then they replaced routine. Now they're beginning to replace presence. A humanoid robot doesn't just perform a task, it occupies the space. It operates continuously. It doesn't need rest. It doesn't need retraining. It doesn't need reassurance or take sick days. One machine learns, every machine knows. So here's the question I think we're not asking loudly enough. That child that's starting school in September or August, what are we preparing her for? What are we teaching her to succeed in a world that we already know is disappearing, and disappearing fast? We're training her for exams that measure recall when recall is now virtually instantaneous and virtually free. We're preparing her for jobs that, in all likelihood, may not exist by the time she qualifies for them, by the time she even graduates high school. And we know this. We don't suspect it. We know this. The projections are not hidden. The trajectory is not a secret. The speed is visible to anyone paying attention. And yet, in most schools, the curriculum remains largely unchanged. The assessments remain largely unchanged. The timetable remains largely unchanged. Why? Because changing is terrifying. And not changing feels safe, even when it isn't. Teachers feel this. They see the students disengaging from content that feels disconnected from reality. They watch AI do in seconds what has been spent weeks trying to teach. They sense that something fundamental is shifted, but the system asks them to carry on as before. Leaders feel it too. Every strategic choice carries risk. Parents want reassurance. Inspectors or accreditation wants compliance. And budget depends on enrollment. Innovation is welcomed in theory, but significant innovation is resisted in practice. And parents feel it too, even if they don't know how to name it. They want their children safe, but they want credentials that open doors. They want the promise that they were sold, that education leads to security. And so everyone holds everyone else in place, not out of stupidity, but essentially out of fear. The house is on fire and we're shackled to the furniture. And if you think about it, previous disruptions, that, industrial revolution and technological revolutions, they've all given us time. They've given us years, decades to adjust. Time for new industries to emerge, time for retraining, time for the curriculum to adjust, time for generations to transition. This time the cycle is massively compressed. The speed of technological change now exceeds the speed of institutional adaptation. And the speed of institutional adaptation exceeds the speed at which most people can reorientate themselves in their lives. And this is what's new. This is what's making it very different. Not the technology itself, but the compression of the time in which to respond. And I think there's another difference that's also less discussed. Previous technologies were tools. You learned to use them, or you didn't. But they didn't pretend to think. But we know that AI is different. It produces answers. It generates solutions. It performs competence, which means that humans must now do something that they've rarely been trained for. They need to discern. Not just know, but judge. Not just receive, but evaluate. Not just answer, but question whether the answer is true. If AI tells you that 4 + 3 is 43, can you recognize the error? And I know that sounds trivial, but scale it up. If AI generates a legal argument, a medical diagnosis, a strategic recommendation, who decides whether it's valid and relevant? This is not a skill that we've emphasized, and it's not a skill that machines can replace. It is perhaps the most human capacity of all, the ability to judge what matters and act on that judgment, even when certainty is unavailable. Education is not just a pipeline into employment. It's a promise, or it was. A promise that effort now leads to opportunity later. A promise that learning has a destination. A promise that the rules won't change faster than a child can grow up. But that promise is breaking. Not because educators failed, but because the world underneath our feet has shifted. The foundations have been crumbling. And yet we keep teaching as if the destination is stable. We keep assessing as if the measures still measure what matters. We keep reassuring parents with confidence that we no longer fully feel. That's not sustainable. And deep down, most educators know it. So if this really is different, if the timetable is compressed, if the skills we elevated are now performed by machines, and if the destination itself is unstable, then the question's not what content should we add, or even what skills should we teach. The question's harder. Why are schools not changing, even when the people inside them can see that they're on fire? What is it that's holding the system in place? And what would it take to break free? If the house is on fire, why isn't everyone running? That's the question that lingers after you see the scale of what's coming. AI compressing cognitive work. Robots replicating physical presence. Timelines shrinking faster than institutions can adapt. Educators aren't blind. Most of them sense it. Many of them know it. So why does so little change? The easy answer is resistance, stubbornness, a professional stuck in its ways. That answer is wrong. What looks like resistance is usually something else. It's rational behavior inside a system that punishes risk. Watch how pressure moves through a school. A teacher wants to try something different. Project-based learning, inquiry-driven, less content, more depth, whatever. But the exams are in May, and the exam doesn't measure depth. It measures coverage. So the teacher naturally hesitates, not because she doesn't believe in the change, but because she can't afford to let her students fall behind on the metrics that still determine their futures and to some extent hers. She's got a mortgage. She has a performance review. She has 20 or 30 families trusting her to deliver results that they recognize. And so she teaches to the test, knowing it's not enough, but unable to prove that something else would be better in the time and space that she's got available. Now step that up a level. A head of school sees the same fire. She wants to redesign assessment, shift towards competency, reduce content load, create space for the capacities that actually matter. But enrollment is fragile. Parents choose this school because of its results. Results mean grades. Grades mean university. University means safety, or at least the appearance of it. If she moves too fast, parents panic. If parents panic, they leave. And if they leave, the budget collapses. And if the budget collapses, there is no school to reform. So she makes incremental adjustments, pilots a project here, adds a well-being program over there, talks about innovation in newsletters while holding the core structure intact. Nothing really changes. Not because she lacks the vision, because she can't risk the institution on a bet that the market isn't ready to reward yet. Move up again. A board governs with fiduciary duty. They're responsible for the school's survival. They may see the same horizon. They read the same reports. They feel the same unease. But their job is to protect continuity, to ensure the school is here in 10, 20, 30 years' time. And continuity, in practice, means not deviating too far from what parents expect and demand, and what inspectors or accreditations measure, and what universities demand. Long-term transformation requires short-term risk, and short-term risk threatens the very stability that makes long-term planning possible. So the board approves cautious strategies, measured language, careful pilots, not because they don't care about the future, because they're accountable for the present. Now look at the system from above all of that. Teachers are constrained by leaders. Leaders are constrained by boards. Boards are constrained by parents. And parents are constrained by universities and employers. Universities are constrained by the same employers, and employers are constrained by markets. And markets are being reshaped by the very technologies that makes this whole chain unstable. Everyone's watching what everybody else is doing. Everyone's waiting for someone else to move first. Everyone's afraid, the way I see it. And this is the invisible trap we're in. Not a conspiracy, not corruption, not incompetence, just a system that's been optimized for stability in a world that no longer rewards it. The incentives are misaligned, but they're not irrational. Parents want safety for their children. That's not unreasonable. Teachers want to keep their jobs. That's not selfish. And leaders want their schools to survive. That's not cowardice. Boards want to fulfill their duty. That's not obstruction. So each actor is responding sensibly to the pressures that they face. And yet, collectively, we produce paralysis. The system selects for caution. It rewards short-term reassurances over long-term readiness. It punishes deviation before it can actually prove itself. And so change becomes something that's discussed, but deferred. Piloted, but contained. Named, but never truly risked. There's another layer that's rarely spoken aloud. I believe many educators are holding two realities at once. The reality that they're accountable to, the sort of grades and accreditation and university placements and parent satisfaction. And the reality that they suspect something is coming, a world where Most of what they're measuring will be performed by machines before their students even reach adulthood. This is not a comfortable position to be in. It produces a particular kind of exhaustion, not burnout from overwork, though there is plenty of that, but it's a fatigue from pretending, from maintaining confidence to the parents and to the community that they no longer feel, from selling a product that they're no longer sure that they believe in. We teach the future that we can still defend, not the one that we suspect is actually coming. And every day the gap between those two futures widens. Parents are caught up in this too. They want their children to be safe. They want credentials that open doors. They want the same promise they were given going through school and university. Work hard, get qualified, and life will be stable. That promise is breaking for them too. They just don't necessarily have the language for it yet. So they demand what they know. They demand high grades, strong results, recognizable pathways. Not because they're blind to change, but because the alternative feels like gambling with their child's future. And no parent wants to be the one who experimented when the safe path was still available. So here's the trap, fully visible. The system cannot change because everyone inside it is making rational choices that prevent change from happening. Fear holds the structure in place. Not fear of innovation, fear of being the only one who moved first and failed. Not fear of the future, fear of losing the present. Not fear of change, but fear of what change might cost before the benefits can be proven. At this point, a reasonable conclusion might suggest itself. If schools are trapped by incentives, then the problem is structural. Fix the incentives, change the policies, reform universities, shift the market signals. Sounds logical, but I think it's insufficient because systems don't just constrain behavior, they shape perception itself. Under sustained pressure, people stop seeing clearly. Risk tolerance shrinks. Time horizons collapse. Decision-making becomes reactive. The danger isn't only that schools can't change fast enough, it's that the pressure itself distorts judgment, making it harder to recognize what kind of change is actually needed. Which raises the question that reform alone can't answer. If the system trains people to respond safely rather than to see clearly, how do we know we're even solving the right problem? When systems can't change structure, they often change language. New words appear in strategic plans. Curriculum documents are rewritten. Mission statements evolve. The work looks different on paper, even when the daily practice looks much the same. That's not dishonesty, it's just how institutions adapt when real adaptation feels too dangerous. You'll hear leveling up or other sort of catchy phrases. And in education, the language we reached for was for skills. For years now, schools have been told the answer lies in skills. Not just knowledge, but higher order thinking skills. You need critical thinking and creativity and collaboration and communication and adaptability. This was important work, don't get me wrong. It shifted the focus from memorization to meaning, from content as an end to content as a means, from passive reception to active application. And frameworks have evolved. Taxonomies were revised and curricula were reworded. And these changes matter. They still matter. The capacities we tried to develop, analyzing, evaluating, creating, they still remain essential. But something has shifted beneath all of these. The assumption was that if we taught these skills well enough, students would be ready for whatever came next. The skills were the destination. Now it's becoming clear that they were only ever the foundation. Because the very capacities education worked so hard to elevate are now being performed by machines. If the future is uncertain, teach students how to think, not just what to know. If jobs are changing, focus on transferable capacities. If content becomes obsolete, emphasize process over product. Reasonable, defensible, progressive. And now increasingly insufficient. Something subtle has happened. The very capacities education works so hard to elevate are now being performed by machines. Instantly, cheaply, at scale. AI can summarize a text, it can compare arguments, it can generate plausible solutions, it can draft essays or write code or plan or create presentations. It can, in other words, perform thinking or something that looks remarkably like it. Or more precisely, it can produce the artifacts schools have long used as evidence of comprehension. The essays, the posters, the comparative analyses, the research reports. It doesn't mean that students no longer need to think, but it does mean that the products that we've relied on to evidence thinking no longer can be trusted to prove that thinking or comprehension exists. A student submits an essay. Is it theirs? Did they wrestle with the ideas, or did they outsource wrestling to a computer? Did understanding happen, or was it just output? We can no longer tell by looking at the product, by looking at the artifact. And if the product doesn't reveal the process, then what exactly are we assessing? And what are we grading? And what are we rewarding? This isn't a question about cheating, it's a question about what learning evidence even means when the artifacts of thought can be generated without thought. This creates an uncomfortable tension. Schools are doubling down on skills frameworks at precisely the moment those skills become harder to distinguish as uniquely human. So the language intensifies. We talk about deeper learning, we talk about authentic task, we talk about transfer, we talk about metacognition. All really valid ideas. Yet the more we refine the language, the more it feels like we're polishing the surface of something that's structurally unstable. Because the problem may not be which skills we're teaching, it may be how we're defining competence itself. I think skills frameworks tend to assume a certain world, a world where problems arrive cleanly defined, information is reliable, and the right method applied correctly produces the right result. In that world, competence means performing the right actions in the right order under the right conditions. This is the natural extension of the industrial age model of education. But real life doesn't work that way. Real life often presents itself as ambiguity, competing signals or incomplete information, pressure to act before clarity arrives. And this is where something important breaks down. Under pressure, oftentimes people don't falter because they lack skills, they falter because they misread the situation they're in. They apply the wrong framework to the wrong problem. They optimize one part and damage the whole. They respond to noise instead of the signal. They act quickly when they should wait. They wait cautiously when they should move. In other words, they perform competently, but incoherently. The skills are present, the judgment's missing. And in a world where change is no longer generational, but visible in real time, that gap between competence and coherence is no longer a minor problem. It is the problem. Here's an example. I've made this mistake myself, so I'm speaking from the heart here. Some years ago, I was leading a school where we sensed student engagement was falling in some key areas. And I did what probably any leader would do. Students were distracted, so results were slipping. Staff were getting frustrated, and there was potentially a downward spiral. You know what it's like. You spend a lot of effort building a strong culture, and when indiscipline or distractions creep in, suddenly it seems to spread, affecting the ethos of the whole school. So we worked to tighten behavior policies. We increased accountability. We added interventions, more tracking, more consequences, more structure. Every action was defensible, every action logical at solving the local problems that we were seeing. but it didn't actually fix the problems. Here's what I failed to see. We had a problem with maybe, 10% of the cohort. But the policies we wrote applied to everyone. The 90% who had never been a problem, who would never have broken the rules anyway, suddenly felt distrusted. They felt policed. The mutual respect that we'd spent years building felt to them like it had been withdrawn. We'd designed a system for the few and imposed it on the many. The behavioral metrics, yes, they improved, but the culture didn't improve. We'd solved a visible problem and deepened an invisible one. And it probably took me longer than I'd like to admit to see what I'd missed. The problem really wasn't the behavior, it was more to do with meaning. Students weren't disengaged because they lacked the discipline. They were disengaged because they couldn't see the point. They couldn't see the big picture. They didn't feel like they belonged in the same way as the other kids did. And they sought out others who felt equally displaced. Trouble sought company. And here's perhaps what I didn't fully understand at the time. These students had somewhere else to look. 30 years ago, a disengaged student had few alternative narratives, really. You went to school or you did nothing. Now, people can see every day people who've skipped all of this and made a fortune anyway. Influencers, creators, dropouts turned entrepreneurs. The algorithm serves them a constant stream of evidence that formal education is optional, maybe even a waste of time. Why sit through a lesson on equations when someone your age is making thousands from a ring light and a telephone? So when I finally asked them, what emerged wasn't just, why does this matter? It's, why does this matter more than what I could be doing instead? And my key takeaway from this was that I had the skills to work on policy and structure. Yeah, that's great. But I didn't have the discernment then to know which problem it was that I was actually solving, or to see how fixing it in one place might break something more important somewhere else. This pattern repeats across education. Leaders chase metrics that measure the wrong things. Teachers cover content that frankly won't matter in 5 years' time. Schools optimize for inspections or accreditations that reward compliance over coherence. Because skills frameworks don't tell you actually what matters. They tell you how to do things. They don't tell you which things are worth doing. They help you execute, but they don't help you orient. And in a world where the ground keeps shifting, I think orientation is everything. At this point, another conclusion feels really tempting. If skills language is failing us, perhaps the real issue is thinking itself. Not what the students can do, but how they interpret what they see. If we could just help people think more clearly, frame problems more accurately, spot the patterns earlier, then maybe everything else would fall into place. That sounds like progress. Sharper analysis, better diagnosis, clearer perception. Surely that's the foundation. But it raises a question we haven't yet faced. If clearer thinking is the answer, why does thinking so reliably collapse when pressure rises? Why do intelligent people misread situations they should understand? Why do well-trained leaders make choices they later regret? Why does insight so often fail to translate into wise action? Perhaps the problem isn't just how we think. Perhaps it's what happens to thinking when the stakes are high and the path is unclear. What does that tell us about what schools are actually preparing people for? By now, a pattern's emerging. Technology is compressing faster than institutions can adapt. Compressing, not just advancing, but collapsing the space between what humans can do and what machines can do. Cognitive work, physical work, creative work, all shrinking at the same time. Systems constrain even well-intentioned educators. Skill frameworks fail under real-world pressure. So perhaps the missing piece is simpler. Perhaps The real problem is that people aren't seeing clearly enough. After all, many failures look, in hindsight, like failures of perception. Leaders chase the wrong priority. Schools respond to symptoms instead of causes. Teams invest energy in initiatives and feel busy but change very little. So we reach for a familiar remedy. Better thinking, sharper analysis, clearer problem framing. Teach people to identify patterns, to read situations more accurately, to make sense of complexity before acting. This feels intuitively right, and it is, up to a point. In education, clarity is often treated as the breakthrough. If teachers could just see the bigger picture, if leaders could diagnose problems more accurately, or if boards could distinguish causes from symptoms, then better decisions would follow. So we invest heavily in analysis, in data, in insights. We build dashboards, we commission reports, we run strategic reviews, and for a moment, things feel sharper. The patterns become visible, the problems get named, the priorities get listed. But then something strange happens. The insight doesn't translate. People see the issue and still make choices that deepen it. This is not a failure of intelligence. Most educators are highly capable. They can analyze complex situations. They can identify what's going wrong. They can articulate what needs to change. So the problem is not blindness. The problem is what happens after something is seen. Under pressure, clarity doesn't automatically lead to wise action. In fact, the opposite often happens. The clearer the risk, the faster the rush to relieve it. The stronger the signal, the quicker the move to respond. And response is where things unravel. Example, a school notices falling results. The data is clear, the trend is visible. So they narrow the curriculum. More time on tested subjects, less time on everything else. Results stabilize for now. But engagement drops, creativity disappears, the culture changes, the underlying problem deepens. Or perhaps a leader senses parent anxiety. The emails are sharper. The questions are harder. So they increase reassurance, more communication, more visible action, more promises. Confidence returns briefly, but the gap between what's promised and what's delivered widens, and so trust erodes. Or a board that detects financial risk. The projections are stark, the margin is thin, so they apply pressure. They cut costs, they increase class sizes, they demand efficiency. The budget balances on paper, but morale collapses, staff leave. The institution weakens from within. Each of these actions makes sense locally. Each one is defensible. Each one is taken by capable people who can see the problem clearly. And yet collectively they often deepen the very problems they were meant to solve. This reveals something uncomfortable. The failure is not primarily one of recognition. It's not that people can't see what's happening. It's that seeing doesn't tell you what must be held steady. Real systems don't collapse because no one noticed the warning signs. They collapse because the response to those signs was reactive rather than deliberate. Pressure collapses time horizons. It rewards action over restraint. It punishes waiting. It makes movement feel like progress. And so people act, not because action is wise, but because inaction feels unbearable. The principal who pauses to think is seen as hesitant. The board that waits for clarity is seen as passive, or the teacher who resists the initiative is seen as obstructive. The system rewards response. It doesn't ask whether the response is right. And that's why clarity becomes dangerous when it's not paired with a capacity to hold it. Seeing the problem is not the same as understanding it. Understanding a problem is not the same as knowing what to do. And knowing what to do is not the same as having the discipline to do it well. Each transition requires something different. And the hardest transition, the one that fails most often, is the move from insight to action. Not because people don't know what to do, but because pressure distorts the space between knowing and doing. It shortens deliberation. It amplifies urgency. It makes the obvious feel like the only move. Here's what this looks like in practice. A leadership team meets to discuss strategy. They've done the analysis, they understand the challenges, they can see that the current path is unsustainable. But the meeting doesn't produce transformation. It produces a list, its actions, its timelines, its responsibilities. Not because the team lacks vision, but because the pressure to act overwhelms the discipline to wait. Something must be decided. Something must be done. Something must be reported. And so the deeper work gets deferred, not rejected, just postponed while the urgent work fills the agenda. Weeks pass, months pass, the list gets longer, but the transformation never arrives. At this point, another conclusion starts to take shape. If recognition isn't enough, then the real problem must lie in execution. Not in seeing the pattern, but in implementing it, in turning insight into action, in making change stick, in building the discipline to follow through. That sounds right. Better implementation, stronger change management, more accountability, more focus, more rigor. But it leads to one question we haven't yet faced. If implementation is the problem, why do well-intentioned actions so often make systems worse rather than better? Why does more effort produce less coherence? Why does more accountability often generate more dysfunction? What kind of capacity is actually required to act wisely under sustained pressure? And why is that capacity so rarely developed in schools, in leaders, or in students? So by now, it's tempting to say that the problem is in implementation. We see the pattern, we understand the risks, we even agree in principle on what needs to change. Yet somehow, nothing quite moves. Initiatives stall, reforms get diluted, good intentions harden into procedures. So the explanation shifts. The issue must be execution, capacity, follow-through. If only schools could implement better managed change more effectively, surely things would improve. This sounds familiar because it's often how large systems have always explained stagnation. And it's how they usually respond. When outcomes are disappointing, pressure increases. Targets tighten. Oversight expands. Reporting multiplies. Action accelerates. And for a while, this works. Things look more controlled, processes become clearer, variation is reduced. But something else begins to happen at the same time. The system starts to treat pressure not as a response to problems, but as a substitute for orientation. Instead of asking, are we doing the right work? It asks, are we doing the work right? Instead of what must be protected, it asks, what can we measure? Instead of, does this really matter? It asks, can it be defended? This is a subtle shift, but a decisive one. Because once pressure becomes the operating system, the system loses the ability to question itself. It can optimize, it can standardize, it can enforce, but it can't really pause to ask whether it's heading in the right direction. In schools, pressure rarely announces itself as pressure. It shows up as urgency, a new initiative, a tightening timeline, accreditation demands, a demand to just get something implemented. Teachers are told to embed the change. Leaders are told to drive improvement. Boards are told to ensure accountability. And when progress stalls, the explanation is typically the same. Not enough effort, not enough focus, not enough discipline. So pressure increases again. More monitoring, more targets, more reporting. The assumption is that pressure produces results, and It does up to a point, but beyond that point, something else reverses. Under sustained pressure, three things seem to happen repeatedly. First is that time horizons collapse. Long-term coherence is traded for short-term reassurance. The strategic gets sacrificed to the urgent. What matters in 5 years loses to what's demanded by Friday. Schools stop asking where they're going and start asking how to survive the week. Second, responsibility drifts. People act outside of their role, not out of ambition, but out of anxiety. Teachers start managing upwards. Leaders start doing teachers' work. Boards start directing operations. Boundaries blur. Roles confuse. Accountabilities become diffuse. And everyone's responsible, yet no one is responsible. Third is that the system confuses motion with direction. Activity increases, meetings multiply, plans proliferate. Everyone's busy, everyone's accountable, everyone's exhausted. And yet the deeper issues remain untouched. The system is moving, but it's forgotten where it's trying to go to. This is how capable institutions lose their way, often through over-coordination in a world that now requires judgment. Pressure feels like leadership. Action feels like progress. Control feels like safety. But these are illusions. The school that responds fastest is not necessarily the school that responds wisest. The leader who acts most visibly is not necessarily the leader who acts most effectively. The board that monitors most closely is not necessarily the board that governs the best. So speed is not the same as direction. Activity is not the same as progress. And control is not the same as coherence. So at this stage, it becomes very difficult to distinguish between two things: stability that protects the future and stability that merely delays reckoning. They look the same from the inside. They both feel like holding things together. Both feel like responsible stewardship. Both feel like doing what must be done. But one builds towards something, and the other just postpones collapse. Many institutions throughout history have reached this point. They didn't collapse because they stopped working. They collapsed because they worked too rigidly in conditions that no longer matched their design. They optimized for a world that had already changed. They enforced standards that no longer served. Or they measured what was measurable and ignored what actually mattered. And by the time they noticed, the capacity to adapt had been eroded by the very pressure meant to ensure survival. Which brings us to uncomfortably close to the present. If pressure is now the operating system, if action has replaced orientation, if compliance has crowded out judgment, then implementation is no longer the solution. It's part of the pattern. Adding more pressure to a system already distorted by pressure doesn't produce transformation. It produces fragmentation. More initiatives, less coherence. More accountability, less trust. More activity, less meaning. So the question shifts again. Not to how do we implement change more effectively, but something much harder. What must a system be able to hold when pressure is highest? What must not bend even when everything else is bending? And who inside these institutions is responsible for holding it? Because if no one is asking that question, if everyone is too busy, then the system isn't being led. It's just being managed into exhaustion. In schools, the question often comes quietly, not from students, but from adults. Teachers who've done everything that's been asked of them. Leaders who've followed all of the reforms that are necessary, and boards who've governed responsibly. And yet, beneath the planning meetings and the performance reviews, a different unease begins to surface. What exactly are we preparing people for now? For a long time, education has relied on a very stable assumption. Learning leads to work. Work leads to identity, and identity leads to meaning. The subjects might change, the jobs might evolve, but the overall arc held. You studied, you qualified, you entered a profession or a job, you progressed, you became someone. And this wasn't just an economic story, it's a psychological one too. Work has given us structure to time. It gave status to effort. It gave coherence to life. When somebody asks, what do you do? The answer located you in the world, where you belong. And schools, whether they named it or not, were built around this part of the promise. Study hard, get qualified, find your place, become who you're meant to be, and find your place in your community. But when work itself begins to fragment, when careers shorten, get automated or disappear or have to be reassembled, that promise weakens. And when the promise weakens, something deeper is exposed. People can adapt to new tools, they can retrain for new roles, they can learn new systems. What's far harder is to adapt to the loss of a stable answer to the question, who am I useful as? Where is my place in society? And this isn't a future problem, it's already here. Graduates entering professions that didn't exist 5 years ago and may not exist in another 5. Mid-career professionals watching their expertise become automated. Skills that they've spent decades developing now performed by software in seconds. Young people asked to commit to pathways when no one can tell them where those pathways lead. So the question is no longer, what job will I have? Or even, will I have a job? It's deeper than that even. What will make me valuable? What will make me needed? What will make me me? And education, I don't think, has a good answer to that. So schools retreat to what can still be defended. Credentials, benchmarks, comparisons, all of these things. Not because they give meaning, but because they give legitimacy. A grade is defensible, a ranking is comparable, a qualification is recognized. These things still open doors, for now, so schools still keep producing them. But the gap between credentials and confidence is widening. Students collect qualifications and still feel unprepared. They achieve benchmarks, but still feel anxious. Or they follow the pathway, but still feel lost. Because credentials answer the question, can you do this? They don't answer the question, does it matter? Students begin to ask questions that curriculum documents don't answer. Why am I learning this? What's it for? What happens if there isn't a place waiting for me? These are not rebellious questions, they're honest ones, and adults often field them first. Teachers wonder why the content they're delivering will matter by the time students actually use it, if they ever will. Leaders might wonder whether the pathways they're promoting will still exist when the students actually graduate and arrive at that destination. And parents, I'm sure, wonder whether the sacrifices they're making will lead where they're hoping. Everyone's pretending just a little more than they used to. And when these questions go unanswered, a quiet substitution takes place. Identity becomes borrowed rather than built. From grades, from rankings, from institutions, from external validation. Students learn to perform success without feeling successful. They learn to achieve without knowing what achievement is for. They become very good at meeting expectations and very uncertain about what they themselves expect. This works until it doesn't. Until the external validation stops, until the next rung isn't there, until the credentials doesn't convert into meaning. And then the question returns louder. Who am I, if not what I do? In systems under strain, people often continue saying what must be said, not because they believe it, but because not saying it feels too dangerous. It isn't dishonesty. It's how institutions protect themselves when the future is unclear. Schools keep promising employability because the alternative, admitting uncertainty, feels like a failure. Parents keep demanding results because the alternative, trusting a new model, feels like risk. And students keep performing because the alternative, pausing to ask why, feels like falling behind. So everyone keeps moving on a path that fewer and fewer people are actually believing in. At this point, another conclusion starts to form. If the real crisis is one of meaning and identity, then perhaps education's task is not primarily economic at all. Perhaps schools need to focus less on readiness for work and more on helping people construct lives of purpose, lives that don't depend on a job title to feel whole. Creativity, contribution, connection, agency. That sounds compelling, even hopeful. But it leaves one question unresolved. If identity can no longer be outsourced to systems or roles, if work can't be trusted to tell us who we are, and if credentials don't carry the meaning they used to, then what capacity must people develop to author their own orientation in the world? Not just adapt to change, but to remain coherent through it. Not just to find work, but to find worth. Not just to perform competence, but to know what competence is for. Where, inside constrained institutions, could that possibly begin? And what would it require of the adults who meant to lead the way? So if change is constrained, and if pressure distorts judgment, if skills frameworks are insufficient, and if identity can no longer be guaranteed by work, then what realistically can be done? Not ideally, not in theory, but inside institutions and schools that still have timetables, budgets, parents' inspections, and payrolls. At this point, most systems reach for one of two responses. The first is escalation. More urgency, more accountability, more reform, more energy applied more forcefully. The second is retreat. Lower expectations, smaller ambitions, a quiet focus on survival. Both feel understandable, but neither of those address the underlying pattern. Because what the previous sections have been circling to is this. The deepest failures we're seeing are not failures of effort or intelligence or of care. They're failures of orientation. We're not used to this. Systems misread what kind of work is required. Leaders apply pressure when clarity is needed. Boards drift into operations when their role is to hold direction. And teachers are asked to solve problems that are not theirs to own. Everyone's working harder and coherence erodes. It's not new. Throughout history, large systems and empires in transition rarely collapse because no one knows how to fix them. But they often fail because the system itself loses the ability to distinguish signal from noise, action from reaction, movement from direction. So where does leverage actually sit? Not in redesigning everything all at once, not in predicting the future correctly, not in finding a new model. That's all outside of our context. But leverage sits upstream of action. It sits in how problems are framed, how roles are held, how pressure is distributed, how people decide what not to do. In other words, leverage sits in how people see before they act. Let me name it directly. I think what education needs to develop in students and in adults is not more skills. It's something I call generative discernment. The capacity to read patterns, not just recognize them, but interpret what they mean. The capacity to judge what matters, to distinguish signal from noise, and to hold that distinction under pressure. The capacity to commit under uncertainty, to stay with a direction when the outcome isn't guaranteed, when persistence is hard and it would be easier to pivot or retreat. And the capacity to create new patterns, not just adapt to change, but to author it, to disrupt what isn't working, to build what doesn't exist yet. This is not a skill in a conventional sense. It's a condition for coherence. Without it, systems fragment, even when populated by capable people. With it, people can navigate uncertainty without panicking, act without overreaching, and contribute without outsourcing their identity to external validation. But discernment doesn't emerge from nowhere. It requires a foundation. You can't judge whether an answer makes sense if you have no sense of the domain. You can't evaluate an AI's output if you lack the underlying knowledge to question it. You can't discern patterns if you've never been taught to recognize the building blocks. And this is where I believe content still matters, but not as an end, but as a foundation. Literacy, numeracy, conceptual understanding, not because these are sufficient, but because without them, discernment has nothing to work with. The goal is not to abandon content. It's to ensure that content serves discernment, not the other way around. Some schools are already finding ways. For many years, schools like High Tech High they've built entire programs around project-based learning, not as an add-on, but as the operating model. Students don't just learn content, they produce work that matters to someone beyond the classroom. The Mastery Transcript Consortium is developing competency-based credentials, ways to show what students can actually do rather than what they've just memorized for an exam. And the IB's programs, 3 programs, use concept-driven inquiry, not topics like the Romans, but with transdisciplinary themes as transferable ideas that can be explored across contexts and centuries. And then there's service learning, not the bake sale kind, but the work that requires genuine discernment. In schools I've led, students have designed and managed reforestation projects with thousands of trees being planted to combat deforestation, or wildlife protection initiatives that required navigating local politics and ecological data and community resistance. And, I know that there's some schools even years ago where students were designing and printing 3D prosthetic limbs for amputees, not as a simulation, but as a real solution for real people. These projects don't just teach content, they demand judgment. They require students to figure out what matters, what's feasible, who's affected, and what the trade-offs that they're willing to make. That's generative discernment in action, not as an abstract goal, but as a lived requirement. These are not fringe experiments, they're functioning models, proof that it's possible to teach differently inside systems that still require accountability. And I think this is where AI changes everything, not as a threat, but as a possibility. If AI can deliver content, then teachers are potentially freed up to do what machines cannot do, to develop discernment, to coach judgment, to build relationships and emotional connection, and develop the capacity to ask whether the answer is true and does it matter, and whether the pattern is significant, and whether the direction is actually worth pursuing. This is not a smaller role for teachers, it's a more important one, but it requires letting go of the old model. The teacher as deliverer of knowledge, the student as the receiver and reproducer. This is frightening. It asks teachers to release control over content and trust that something deeper can be developed in its place. It asks leaders to defend approaches that don't fit neatly into accreditation frameworks. It asks parents to accept that their child's education might not look like their own. The fear is real, and it must be named, not dismissed, because transformation doesn't stall for lack of ideas, it stalls because fear holds the old structure in place. So what can be done on Monday? Not everything, that's for sure, but at least we have to do something. Maybe we can pause before adding more, before launching another initiative, before introducing another accountability measure. Ask, does this help students see more clearly, commit more deliberately, or create more courageously? If not, is there a way of not doing it? You can stop what isn't working, the activities that keep students busy but add no cognitive value, the assessments that measure compliance rather than understanding, and the content that exists only because it's always been there. Stopping requires courage, but it creates space, and space is where discernment develops. You can start the conversation that most schools avoid. What are we actually preparing students for? And do we believe it? What would we do differently if we admitted what we suspect is true? This is not a comfortable conversation, but it is an honest one. And honest conversations are where change begins. The window for full-scale transformation, where values, assessments, and universities and incentives could all be redesigned together, I think, in my opinion, we've lightly passed that one. 5-10 years ago, it may have been possible. Today, I think most institutions are operating in survival mode themselves, protecting their own revenue, legitimacy, and continuity. In that context, incremental tweaking isn't really progress, it's more of the motion without direction. But stabilization is possible. Stabilization is not giving up on change. It's what makes change survivable. It means holding the line on what matters while the ground continues to shift. It means refusing to add pressure when orientation is needed. It means protecting the space for discernment in students, in teachers, in leaders, in boards, even when the system rewards busyness instead. Education doesn't need to predict which jobs will exist. It does not need to solve the future, but it does need to help people develop the capacity to judge what matters, to stay with that judgment under pressure, and to create value for others, even when the path is unclear. That's what I'm calling generative discernment. It's not a curriculum change, it's an architectural shift. And it doesn't begin with students, it begins with adults, with whoever's willing to pause, to name the pattern that they're inside, and choose not to add more pressure when orientation is required. So the final question is not how do we fix education? It's quieter but harder. In a world that will keep changing faster than institutions can, who is willing to help others see clearly enough to act coherently? What would it take to hold that line? And if not you, then who? So I've made some fairly challenging assertions up to this point. Technology compressing societal change faster than institutions and schools can adapt. School systems are trapped and unable to change because of the demands of parents and universities and employers, despite the fact that credentials are becoming less valuable for the work of the future. And identity itself, that has for so long been tied to work, will probably compound mental health challenges in the future. And I proposed a term, this idea of generative discernment, effectively encapsulating 4 different dimensions. The capacity to read patterns, not just to recognize them, but to interpret what they mean. The capacity to judge what matters and hold that judgment under pressure. The capacity to commit when outcomes are uncertain, to persist towards something worth persisting towards. And 4th, the capacity to create new patterns, to author, not just adapt, which is agency in itself. But naming something's not the same as understanding it, and understanding it is not the same as knowing what to do. So what does generative discernment actually look like in schools? And how do we develop it while recognizing that we're trapped within this system that is limited and without dismantling what already works? So before going further, I need to clarify something. This is not an argument against subject knowledge. It's not a downgrade of academic rigor, and it's not a call to abandon exams. That's outside of my sphere of influence. Strong mathematics still matters. Deep disciplinary understanding still matters. And any poorly taught subjects will undermine everything that I'm about to describe. What's changed is not the value of knowledge, but the role it now plays. Knowledge is not the destination, it's the foundation. You can't discern whether an answer makes sense if you have no sense of the domain. You can't evaluate what an AI produces if you lack the understanding to be able to question it and interrogate it. You can't judge patterns if you've never learned to recognize the building blocks. Content, conceptual understanding, skills, these remain essential, but they serve discernment. Discernment doesn't serve them. That's the reorientation. And look, many schools already do many of the things that develop generative discernment. They have drama programs, they have some service learning programs going on, they've got sports, they've got a history class, they've got creative arts, probably develop leadership opportunities for students and maybe an outdoor education program. The issue is how these are understood. For most schools, or most people, I think they typically sit in the same sort of mental category. That's enrichment. It's nice to have, it's valuable, yes, but ultimately supporting the real work, which is the academic, examinable, credentialed. And I think that's the shift that matters most. I no longer think that these are enrichment activities that support the main work. I think they are the core human work itself, although currently not being recognized as such. Let me show you what I mean. Let's take an example of drama, and it's often justified in terms of building confidence and self-expression and engagement. All true, but incomplete. Drama is one of the few places where students must inhabit perspectives that they don't hold. They have to navigate power, whether it's loyalty or fear or consequence, and act within moral ambiguity without any tidy resolution. That's not enrichment. That's judgment under social pressure. Now let's take sport, which is often framed as teamwork and fitness and healthy competition. Again, all true, but partial. Sport trains decision-making under fatigue, recovery after failure, discipline without immediate reward, and commitment when the outcome is uncertain. That's not character building as a side benefit. That's the deliberate development of commitment under pressure. And think about service learning, often positioned as maybe giving back to the community or just community engagement. But authentic service learning, not a Friday bake sale. It's really the responsibility for real consequences, for ethical choices under constraint with action that's maybe there's no guaranteed success. Discerning what actually helps versus what merely feels good. That's not just enrichment, that's learning to create patterns that matter for others. And history, taught consequentially, not as recall. History has the unique ability to develop pattern recognition across time, to understand how rational decisions produce disastrous outcomes, learn humility in the face of complexity, and see how systems trap even the well-intentioned people. That's not content to be memorized, that's training in reading patterns, the first capacity of generative discernment. So you see what's happening? Drama develops judgment under pressure. Sport and outward bound develops commitment under uncertainty. Service learning develops a capacity to create patterns that matter. And history is an opportunity to develop the capacity to read patterns across time. These map directly onto the four capacities we've named. Read patterns, judge what matters, commit under uncertainty, create new patterns. So the architecture is already there. It's just not recognized as architecture. Perhaps worse, it's relegated to a nice-to-have extra. And this is precisely the problem. It's structural fragmentation. Now, subjects are protected, rightly, by subject leaders. Drama is owned by drama, history by history, sport by PE department, service learning, maybe pastoral teams, and outdoor education, maybe sitting somewhere else. Each does its job well, but typically no one is responsible for the through line, or the red thread, as you might say in Scandinavian countries. Who in your school is asking what human capacity is being deliberately developed over time? Where do students practice judgment under increasing complexity? And how do these experiences connect rather than simply coexist? It's not a teaching failure, it's a curriculum coherence problem, and it's precisely the work that the leadership must own. So what does it look like when somebody takes responsibility for that through line, that red thread? It starts with a question asked at every planning conversation, basically. What capacity does this develop, and how does it connect to what came before and what comes next? So it's not about content. What content does it cover? And it goes beyond what skills does this teach, but rather it says what human capacity is being deliberately compounded. Now, some schools use existing frameworks to hold this. The IB Learner Profile, for example, names attributes like inquirer and thinker and risk taker, and asks teachers to track development across subjects and years. Other frameworks go further than that. The Learning Deck, which I developed, maps teaching and learning across two axes: inform, inquire, inspire, and enjoy, engage, empower. So from inform, inquire, inspire, that moves learners from pattern exposure through pattern interrogation to pattern creation. Enjoy, engage, empower moves learners from emotional safety to cognitive investment to agentic responsibility. Discernment requires both axes operating together. Without enjoy, judgment collapses under pressure, and without empower, creation never happens. The intersections create 9 profiles that describe different kinds of learning experience, not to replace subjects, but to give curriculum leaders a shared language for identifying where discernment is being developed and where it's being assumed, and where it's missing entirely. The specific framework matters less than the discipline of asking questions, because without a deliberate through line, that thread, student experience fragments. Good, maybe, but fragmented nevertheless. And fragments don't necessarily compound into capacity. Now, I know at this point a fair concern will arise, which it matters, what do we stop doing to make space for this? Because if the answer is nothing, then it becomes just another addition, more weight on an already buckling system. The answer isn't to remove subjects, but it's to remove work that doesn't transfer. So I'm guessing that every curriculum really contains legacy content that maybe hasn't been questioned in years, or duplication across subjects that no one's mapped. Recall-heavy materials that test memory but builds no judgment. The shift is not from knowledge to skills. We've seen why that framing fails. The shift is from content that terminates in recall to learning that feeds discernment. That's the emphasis, not demolition. And it requires something uncomfortable: the courage to stop doing things that feel safe but add no lasting value. Now let me say why this matters beyond schools. In a world of automated execution, the AI-driven Tesla Optimus, for example, certainty becomes seductive. When thinking itself takes such effort and answers are cheap, people stop wrestling with difficult concepts and just start accepting. When complexity is uncomfortable and the algorithm offers clarity, people stop holding tension and start choosing sides. That's not hypothetical. We see this already happening. The rise of ideological polarization, the recruitment pipelines of radicalization, the fracturing of shared reality into algorithmic bubbles, political manipulation that targets emotional reflex, not reasoned judgment. These aren't failures of information, they're failures of discernment. People who can't hold that ambiguity become easily recruitable. People who can't recognize a trade-off become easy to manipulate, and people who can't judge before acting become dangerous to themselves and to others. So generative discernment isn't really a luxury for privileged schools, it's protective for our societies. It enables students that are going to grow up to be adults of the future to resist simplistic narratives, to spot manipulation before it lands, to participate in society without surrendering all agency, and critique systems without abandoning them. In a world being reshaped by forces that most people don't understand, AI, automation, geopolitical fracturing, the rewriting of the global order, the ability to think for oneself is more important than ever. It's actually our survival. So what does this ask of teachers and leaders? Nothing here diminishes subject expertise. In fact, it raises its importance, because subjects no longer justify themselves by coverage alone, but by the kind of judgment they help form. A history teacher isn't just teaching history, they're training pattern recognition and humility in the face of complexity. A drama teacher isn't just directing plays, they're developing the capacity to hold ambiguity and act under uncertainty. A PE teacher is not just running a fitness session, they're building commitment, recovery, and decision-making under pressure. This doesn't replace what teachers do. It reveals what they are already doing, and it asks to be taken seriously enough to align. So let me bring this back to where we started. The earlier parts asked really, what's school actually preparing students for? Which leads to, it has to be to the work that only humans can do, and therefore we have to train for it deliberately. Generative discernment isn't an add-on. It's not a program. It's not the rejection of what schools already value, but it is a recentering. Content, skills, conceptual understanding, these remain, but they point towards something. The capacity to read patterns others miss. The capacity to judge what matters when the signals conflict. And the capacity to commit when certainty is unavailable, and the capacity to create new patterns for oneself and for others. This is what machines can't do, and this is what humans must do. And if schools are to remain credible, not just academically, but socially, ethically, and for society, this is the work that we can no longer afford to leave unnamed. So the question is not whether your school does any of this. I know most schools do to some extent or a large extent. The question is whether anyone's responsible for connecting it, whether the through line is visible and intentional, whether generative discernment is an accident of good teaching or an intentional outcome of coherent design. And if it isn't yet, what would it take to make it so?